Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The rain comes sideways in Boston, needling my cheeks as the revolving door at Hale and Klein turns me into the lobby. I smooth my blue wool scarf, the one I knit for Ethan when he was 10, and convinced a scarf was armor against December, and press a manila folder to my ribs so the papers won't curl. The security guard nods. Top floor, I nod back. The elevator mirrors return a version of me I almost recognize, 64 silver at the temple's lipstick, braver than the morning deserves. The receptionist says Ethan is between calls the way weather is between storms. Glass and chrome everywhere. I sit on a low leather sofa and balance the folder on my knees. Inside are scan results, a protocol, a number that sounds like a dare. Even here I can feel the clinic's fluorescent hum, as if the light followed me across town and took a seat beside me. In Dr. Camilla Rivera's office there had been no theatrics. She folded her hands on the printout and spoke like a bridge engineer, naming weights and spans. Margot, the scans confirm an aggressive lymphoma. The good news is you're a strong candidate for targeted immunotherapy. We'd start immediately. Immediately rang like a fire alarm, inescapable present. It's out of network, she added. Hospital pricing puts the first cycle near $95,000. Her face held only the soft pressure of the truth. Will it work? I asked. It gives you a real shot. I don't say that lightly. She touched the pages. I'm here for you. You can tell when a person trained for science still believes in kindness. Ethan steps out now, the door closing behind a conference call mid-sentence. He's handsome in a way, photographs understand, crisp edges, a quick smile, the posture of someone used to winning. Mom. His voice drops the pitch he uses for clients. The receptionist waves us through. In his corner office, Boston lies wet and proud beyond the glass slate roofs shining in the rain. I place the folder on his desk. I had my follow-up this morning. He flips the cover. His eyes move line by line, lawyer fast, then slow. A muscle in his jaw ticks. Jesus, Mom. He comes around the desk and folds me in. For a second, I allow myself the foolishness of comfort-cloned shoulder, the old geometry of a son's arm around a mother. There's a plan, I say when he lets me go. Dr. Rivera thinks a targeted protocol could help. It starts next week. The hospital wants payment up front. $95. I put the number on the desk between us like a paperweight. He eases back onto the edge of the desk, hands clasped. $95, he repeats as if repetition could domesticate it. Insurance won't touch it. Out of network. We appealed. They sent a pamphlet on coping with stress. He huffs a laugh, then catches himself. I can see him sorting drawers in his head. Emergency Fundhouse project partnership track. Reputation, always reputation. Let me talk to Sloan, he says. We've got obligations stacked this quarter. The retaining wall on the new place came in higher. And there's the museum initiative she's co-chairing. But he spreads his hands. We'll figure something out. There are programs, right? Grants, I'll look into it. The word figure does not carry weight. It floats like a helium balloon over the desk. I nod anyway because this is still my boy and because nodding is sometimes the last thing you can give. He walks me to the elevator. The receptionist says to take care. I will, I answer as if care were a bus you could catch if you waited long enough. Outside, I turn left instead of heading for the subway. 3 blocks down, a diner's neon script hisses against the storm like an old friend clearing its throat. The bell over the door announces me to nobody in particular. I take the corner booth that used to be ours on Saturdays after Little League hot chocolate, then coffee now. The waitress pours without asking. On the far wall, a muted TV chases football highlights. A man in a soaked Red Sox cap laughs at something I can't hear. I open my notebook, ledger lines on one side, blank space on the other. Habit, from years keeping books at the community college. On the left, I write immunotherapy start date Monday. Under it, $95,000 due. On the right, I list everything that might possibly add up to a life: pension savings, the Subaru with rust along the wheel. Well, the parish emergency fund I once contributed to the favors I have not yet asked. A raindrop shakes itself loose from my sleeve and feathers the ink. My phone vibrates across the laminate like a nervous beetle. A voicemail from Ethan. I don't press play. The waitress slides me a slice of apple pie I didn't order. On the house, she says. I thank her and take a bite. Cinnamon opens in my mouth like a door to an old room. A blonde boy in a thrift store parka declaring winter less frightening with the right scarf. I tuck the memory back where it belongs and pay the check with cash that feels like it should have more weight. Back in my apartment, the radiator knocks like an impatient neighbor. I kick off my wet shoes and spread the folder on the kitchen table beside the mail. A glossy envelope sits on top of the stack, the kind thick enough to pretend at importance. The return address is the Museum of Contemporary Art. I run a thumb under the flap and slide out a card perfumed with something floral and expensive. An evening at the edge, it reads in silver type. Black tie, silent auction, rooftop fireworks, weather permitting. Suggested donation levels march down the page like a ladder to a private balcony, VIP tables priced like a year of someone else's life. The apartment is quiet except for radiator and rain. I set the invitation beside the treatment plan. The card is heavy. The paper makes a sound like certainty. I finally tap Ethan's voicemail and hold the phone close to keep the words from echoing around the room. He says he loves me. He says he needs a day to look into options, to ask around to see what programs exist, to coordinate with Sloan because they've committed to some things. He promises to get back to me. I listen twice, then save the message. The scarf hangs from a chair back, darkened by rain. The wool smelling faintly of that winter when the world seemed fixable with a pattern and patience. I sharpen a pencil turn to the ledger side of the page and add a new line under the others. Total due $95,000. I underline it once hard enough to leave an indentation on the sheet below. The morning after the invitation arrived, Boston thawed into a thin gray drizzle that felt like indecision. Ethan's name lit my phone before the kettle started to sing. He sounded as if he were standing in a room where every surface echoed. He'd been reading up on the protocol. There were foundations, he said. Sloan knew someone on a hospital board. The museum event was locked for Friday. Co-chairs didn't cancel. He was working the phones. I said I appreciated it and let the water go cold. At the hospital, the oncology finance office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. A woman named Kendra took me into a cubicle where the walls were covered with calendars, each day a small box waiting for a decision. She read my file carefully, then turned the monitor so I could see. Payment was required before the first infusion. Assistance programs existed, yes, but their timelines did not answer to diagnoses. We can bundle the pharmacy and chair time as a single cycle, she said, highlighter in hand. I'll flag your case. Her voice didn't promise miracles. It promised attention, which felt rarer. St. Bridget's Fellowship Hall had the bounce of a basketball game played 20 years earlier and never fully ended. Pastor Lee opened a metal cash box and pushed a form toward me, with the gentleness of a person who does everything as if it were a sacrament. The emergency envelope for parishioners wasn't much, he said, but it didn't require 5 signatures and a month of explanations. He added a plate of oatmeal cookies to the table as if money traveled better with company. I sign-thanked him and folded the check into my wallet the way you fold a photograph. The apartment became a ledger I could walk through. I washed and vacuumed the Subaru until the gray paint remembered its original optimism, then photographed it in a slice of reluctant sunlight. I wrote the ad with the rust named honestly and the mileage set down without apology. I found my mother's pearl studs in a velvet square and studied them the way you study handwriting from a person you miss. I slid them into a consignment envelope initialed 3 places and left the shop with my ears colder than when I'd gone in. On the phone with the retirement account, a pleasant voice named Heather told me about penalties and withholding as if we were discussing weather along a highway we both used. I wrote the numbers in pencil and did the math twice while she waited. When the sum held, I said yes. She asked if I wanted to speak with a financial counselor about long-term planning. I said that this was long-term planning. The hold music returned, trying its best to be a river. By late afternoon, the Subaru had a buyer who smelled like engine oil and told me he'd keep it going another 50,000 miles if the transmission stayed kind. We shook hands. I signed the title, patted the dash as if it could feel, and walked home with a cashier's check that looked heavier than it was. In the kitchen, I lined up the checks on the table beside the invitation church car retirement distribution. The museum card caught light from the window and threw it back like a dare. Friday arrived scrubbed and bright, the city trying on spring like a dress that mostly fits. I borrowed a wrap from Mrs. Keegan down the hall and stood outside the Museum of Contemporary Art while the projection turned the facade into a moving geometry I didn't have the vocabulary for. Inside, volunteers in tuxedos arranged champagne pyramids with the care of surgeons. The program listed an evening at the edge in silver letters that looked like they would cut if you pressed too hard. I took a chair near the back, the kind you rent by the 100, and balanced the booklet on my knees. The silent auction read like a horoscope for the affluent, a weekend in Nantucket with a private sale, an in-home tasting with a chef whose haircut had its own publicist, a paddleboard lesson with a weather anchor who smiled like a forecast. Little white bid cards waited for pens like small hungry mouths. Suggested donor tiers climbed the page toward a rooftop I wouldn't see. Under the chandeliers, Sloane was a seam of light stitched through the room. Her dress caught the bandstand glow and returned it brighter. Her hug for strangers was as practiced as a signature. Ethan joined her on stage, tie a half shade darker than confidence. He spoke about stewardship and belonging the way culture threads a city together. He was very good phrases that clicked into place like showroom cabinets. Applause dusted the air. The MC thanked the co-chairs and mentioned fireworks weather permitting. I traced the serif letters of edge with my thumb, then slipped out to the lobby where a Calder Mobile turned slowly, as if keeping time for a song nobody else could hear. Outside, the wind smelled like rain stored on a high shelf. A couple laughed while a town car slid to the curb. I walked to the bus stop and kept my eyes on the gutter so I wouldn't catch my reflection in the museum glass. On the bus, a boy in a Red Sox hoodie fell asleep on his mother's shoulder, his jaw slack with trust. I remembered the weight of Ethan's head when he used to do the same, the way a child commits his body to you without terms. Saturday belonged to errands that were also decisions. At the credit union, a woman named Patrice explained a medical bridge loan in the tone of someone who understands that words like bridge mean nothing until you walk across. She copied my documents, asked 2 questions about income, and stamped a form with a sound that rankled and reassured at once. "We can fund Monday morning," she said. Funding was a word with bones. I nodded, signed, and watched my signature grow slightly worse each time I wrote it. At home, I made a list and let it rearrange me. I added the bridge loan total to the church, checked the Subaru sale, the retirement withdrawal, last year's tax refund I had forgotten in a folder labeled Later. I gathered them on the kitchen table and squared the corners like a stack of napkins at a picnic. The invitation, still perfumed with something floral and expensive, rode the top of the mail. I added it to the bottom of the pile where it made less noise. Monday, the infusion room held 5 chairs and enough light to name every surface. A nurse named Tasha wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm and asked me to confirm my name and date of birth 3 times, as if precision could be persuaded by repetition. The IV tape tugged at my skin the way a memory tugs at a door. Dr. Rivera stepped in, touched my shoulder with 2 fingers and said, "You're ready." There's a justice to that sentence even when nothing else feels just. The medicine moved slowly, a cold braid entering the vein and asking for patience. I watched the bag empty the way you watch an hourglass part, faith part counting. Across from me, a man with a baseball cap pulled low, slept with his mouth open, the kind of sleep that belongs to surrender. Tasha adjusted the rate, checked the line, and brought me ginger ale that tasted the way kindness tastes when it comes in paper cups. My phone buzzed. A photo from Ethan filled the screen, a chandelier erupting into sparks. The caption read, "Crushed it for the arts." I flipped the phone face down without replying and focused on the tiny drip that measured this hour into seconds. Afterward, the world widened and narrowed at once. The hallway seemed longer, the elevator a box borrowed from someone else's life. Outside March, sun flickered like a reluctant idea. Kendra met me downstairs to collect the payment. The cashier's check made a flat, soft sound on her desk. She slid me a receipt and circled the date of the next session, her highlighter making neon out of the inevitable. "Call me if you need anything," she said. I told her I would and tried to mean it. At home, the radiator had invented a new rhythm. I poured water, forgot the kettle, poured it again, and finally settled on the sofa with the ledger balanced on my knees. On the left page, I wrote the name of the drug I couldn't pronounce without effort. Then the number again, $95,000. Under it, I wrote each source the way a mason sets. Stone's Church Car Retirement Bridge Loan. I checked the math twice. Numbers are not comfort, but they are honest. A text from Ethan arrived as the light thinned. "How did it go? Been slammed all day. Call later," I typed. First infusion done. I erased done and tried completed. I erased that too. I sent nothing and placed the phone on the windowsill where it could cool beside the glass. Near the sink, the invitation leaned against a mug like a guest who had stayed too long. I slid it into the drawer with the twist ties and the spare batteries. When the drawer closed, the kitchen felt quieter. In the bathroom mirror, my face looked like a face that had been busy. I tied back my hair and saw the stripe of silver my stylist calls character. The blue scarf hung from the shower rod, still slightly damp from the walk home. I pressed its wool to my cheek and set it on the radiator to finish what the day had started. Before bed, I opened the ledger again, the pencil warm from my hand. On the line below the total, I wrote one word that belonged to the present tense, and nothing else paid. I drew the underline carefully hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath, then closed the book and slid it beneath the folder on the table where it could wait without arguing. The second infusion settled into my arm with less argument than the first, as if my body had decided we were partners in an uncomfortable business. Tasha taped the IV with a tenderness that made the fluorescent lights less cruel. Dr. Rivera came by at the end, reviewed the chart, and spoke in the clear way that made numbers feel like handholds. There would be a stretch between cycles long enough to leave town if I wanted air that didn't remember my old routines. "If you travel," she said, "bring records. I'll coordinate with a partner clinic if needed." She saw me tuck the ledger into my bag and smiled like someone recognizing a fellow organizer. The apartment had learned all my footsteps. Every time I crossed the kitchen, the radiator issued a hollow knock as if it were counting with me. I folded the blue scarf into my carry-on set, the folder of test results beside it, and taped an index card to the inside flap with my diagnosis medications and Dr. Rivera's number in block letters. It felt like pinning a name tag to a version of myself I hadn't intended to meet. The flight into Albuquerque skimmed a ceiling of cloud and broke into blue so sudden the cabin seemed to exhale. From the window, the land unfurled in browns and reds, a patchwork that didn't apologize for its seams. A shuttle delivered me to Santa Fe along a highway bordered by scrub and sky. The driver kept up a soft commentary about mile markers and where the snow sat in January. I answered enough to be polite and let the rest pass like low music. The casita I rented for a month sat behind a main house painted the color of warm bread. Its single room held a bed, a small table, and a kitchenette that confessed its limitations, but offered a stovetop anyway. A Kiva fireplace crouched in the corner like a friendly animal. The window framed a strip of mountain that changed character whenever the light reconsidered itself. I unpacked the way people do when they intend to leave again carefully, but with one hand still on the handle. Santa Fe introduced itself in smells, pinon smoke, sun, on dust, green chili from somewhere nearby, on Canyon Road galleries, lined up like a conversation conducting itself in glass. I walked slowly, resting when the long New Mexico brightness asked for it. A cafe near the end of the street caught me with the promise of shade and the sight of a ceiling fan trying earnestly. The chalkboard menu offered coffee and a stew I didn't know but wanted to know. I ordered both and carried my tray to a corner table with a view of the door. He appeared not long after, balancing a tray in one hand and the way small business owners balance everything else in the other. "You're new," he said, not as a challenge but as a welcome. He was maybe late 40s with a beard that hadn't decided on a single length. His name tag read Ben in block letters like the ones on my index card. When he set down the bowl, the steam smelled like something green that had negotiated peace with fire. I told him I was visiting for treatment and rest in that order, and that the stew was excellent. He laughed. "First timer, and you went straight for green chili, respect." He wiped an invisible mark from the corner of my table and nodded at the ledger I'd set down without meaning to. "You're a list person." "I am," I said. "Lists and columns. I kept books for community college for 30 years. The habit didn't retire with me." Ben pressed his lips together the way people do when an idea knocks. "I've got a habit I can't shake," he said, lowering his voice as if the espresso machine were untrustworthy. "Artists around here, they're brilliant on canvas and allergic to receipts. I run some books on the side, but the shoeboxes keep multiplying. You looking for a few hours a week, I pay modestly and compensate with gratitude and soups." The proposition slid into the room like a bird through an open window. I thought of Kendra's highlighter and Dr. Rivera's precise kindness, and the way the ledger felt right in my hands. "Bring me one shoebox," I said. "We'll see if it speaks." It turned out that shoeboxes do speak when you line their contents up by date and breathe quietly. I met Ben on Tuesday afternoons at a small table in the back where the light fell generous. He brought coffee and a stack of envelopes with the hopeful look of a man introducing an unruly friend. I made piles, invoices, receipts, bank statements, the odd napkin with a number in excited handwriting. The stories gathered themselves into columns that behaved. When the numbers agreed with each other, it was like translating a language that had been waiting under the skin. Word moved the way it always does on the back of friendliness and coincidence. A potter needed to understand whether her studio could afford a second kiln. A photographer wanted to know why cash felt thinner than his calendar. An older couple arrived together with a plastic grocery bag of paper and a shared worry about mixing retirement and generosity. We sat with coffee and later green chili stew that convinced our throats to forgive us. I sketched simple budgets with friendly names instead of strict ones. Rent, food, medicine, car, the sly category I called breathing room. People exhaled when they saw it there in pencil. On my fourth Tuesday, a reporter from the local paper stopped by for a latte and left with a quote. She returned the next day with a notebook and the same alert brightness shared by good dogs and good journalists. She asked questions with soft endings and took pictures of hands instead of faces. When the article ran, a friend at the main house slid it under my door. The headline made me smile in spite of myself. "The Ledger Lady, a visitor helps Santa Fe count what matters." The photo showed my fingers on a column and the corner of the blue scarf like a flag in a small country. The casita taught me a new schedule. Morning walks before the sun decided otherwise. Naps in the hour that followed lunch, work in the stretch where shadows lengthened, and math seems to sit up straighter. On weekends, I let myself be led to places with names that felt like charms, bandolier to Sukway, the plaza, where music showed up even when it hadn't been invited. I learned to keep a metal water bottle with me and to step into shade as if it were a room. When my strength dipped, I obeyed it without the old Boston argument between productivity and worth. One evening, Ben introduced me to a group who met in the back after closing on Thursdays. A painter with a laugh you could hear from the street. A weaver whose loom had more to say than most people. A retired math teacher who camped in a van and knew every way to make coffee. They swapped tips on labels and deadlines, traded warnings about shipping companies, and shared jars of pickle something. I listened more than I spoke and contributed only when numbers might de-escalate a worry. It felt like sitting at a table that expanded as needed, adding leaves in the middle without anyone noticing the seam. Dr. Rivera called after the next lab results posted. Her voice gave me the contours before the numbers progressed that could be named without jinxing it. We talked about coordinating the upcoming infusion with a clinic in Albuquerque. She said she'd make the calls. I pressed the phone to my ear and let her competence replace air for a moment. After we hung up, I wrote the date in the ledger and underlined it, then went outside where the evening sky burned a clear, unembarrassed orange. I passed a gym on my way back from the market, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows designed to convert effort into advertising. A man with a trainer counted lunges while the trainer watched himself in the mirror. The trainer's face was one of those faces that understand phones better than people. I looked away, then back, pulled by the odd magnetism of recognition without a file name. On the sidewalk, a poster curled at the edges advertised a wellness curation seminar with a photo of a woman whose smile had more teeth than relief. The name at the bottom, Sloane Carter, was printed in a font that believed in itself. I didn't stop walking. Back at the casita, I set the groceries down, lined the cans of beans in a row like patient soldiers, and slid the poster image from my mind, the way you slide a piece of mail into a drawer you don't open often. I made tea and carried it to the table where the ledger waited. Ben had left another shoebox. I lifted the lid, inhaled the dry smell of paper and ink, and began sorting the way you would smooth a wrinkled shirt on your lap before a meeting. Days folded into each other with the steadiness I had not trusted I would ever know again. The infusion in Albuquerque went to plan. The nurse there had the same efficient warmth as Tasha, and the chair reclined with a sigh that made me think of hotel bathtubs. I brought the article from the Santa Fe paper and tucked it into the pocket of the folder, not for show, but as proof to myself that life collected evidence in both directions. Ben insisted on paying more than modestly and compromised by feeding me lunch too. The cafe's back table became a kind of office. People arrived with questions and left with homework. I kept the tone light and insisted on pencils. On a tackboard near the register, a handwritten sign appeared one morning, Silver Compass Budget Help for Artists and Retirees. Ask for Margot. I had not chosen the name, but when I saw it, the words felt true enough to carry. In the late afternoons, when the casita's single window poured light like a deliberate act, I took out the scarf and draped it over the chair back. The wool held the smell of Boston winter, even here miles in altitude away. I found myself touching it when the room went quiet, as if the texture might remind my skin of other seasons. The ledger sat open on the table, a steady, rectangular promise. When the day wanted a shape, I drew it there in lines and numbers and the occasional note to future me in the margin. Rest. Eat something soft. Stand outside at dusk. A message arrived one evening from an address I knew as well as my own. The subject line held a single word, Mom. I watched it on the screen for a long time, then marked it unread and set the phone face down. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere I couldn't see, and the sound threaded itself through the hour like a needle. I turned off the lamp, let the casita return to its own small night noises, and lay down with the knowledge that the next morning would need coffee and columns, and whatever the mountain decided to do with its light. By the time the wind turned the plaza flags into straight lines, the email with the single-word subject had grown into a handful of missed calls, and then one I answered because I was tired of rehearsing silence. Ethan's voice was smaller than I remembered. He asked if we could meet. He didn't give me a reason I didn't already hear behind the words. We chose the cafe because neutral ground is easier to breathe on. Ben kept the corner table for us and pretended the milk steamer needed all his attention. When Ethan walked in, I stood without meaning to surprise by how much of him had thinned. He wore a suit that had once belonged to a different week. The hem showed the memory of a better iron. His eyes flicked to the room's edges the way people do when they no longer trust entrances and exits. "Hi, Mom," he said, and it sounded like something he'd practiced facing a mirror. "Sit," I said, and it came out kinder than I expected. I pushed a glass of water toward him. He drank like a person who'd spent the morning talking too fast. He began with a sentence that tried to be a summary and failed. "Everything's come apart," he said, and then the details arrived, tripping over one another to prove they were true. Sloan had turned her wellness curation from a panel into a brand into a labyrinth. There were Delaware LLCs with clean names and messy purposes, a lifestyle foundation with a tax-exempt posture, and for-profit habits, a tech venture that existed in pitch decks and nowhere else. Ethan signed things because love can look a lot like trust when you're looking from the inside. They needed my name on authorization letters, he said, for legitimacy, for banking, for the optics with certain donors. He toyed with a paper napkin until it gave up its shape. I told myself I was helping the city, that this was how you play at a certain level. "What happened?" I asked. He looked at me over the napkin ruins. "Invoices paid out to contractors that don't exist. Wire transfers to marketing in amounts that were round and frequent. A short-term note taken against our house for production infrastructure. And then an investigation letter from the Attorney General's office, the firm asking me to take a leave while they assessed exposure." He swallowed. Sloan moved her clothes into storage and then moved herself to a rental in Los Angeles to stabilize the brand image. She said distance was strategic. His laugh landed wrong. She told me not to be dramatic. Ben set down 2 bowls of stew and retreated without comment. Ethan stared at the green as if it could tell him how to proceed. I watched him not eat fingers at his temple ring spinning. "Do you have counsel?" I asked. "I met with a white-collar guy yesterday. Retainers 50. He said if there's a way through, it starts with evidence I don't have and documents I can't find." He lifted his hands in a little surrender. He also said I needed to stop apologizing in complete sentences. I reached into my tote and took out a folder I hadn't decided to bring until the moment I put it there. Months earlier, I'd seen a poster curl on a Santa Fe gym window, Sloan's name at the bottom in a font that believed itself permanent. I had noticed a trainer with a face that treated mirrors like friends. I had read the way bookkeepers read filings that are public, if you know where to look. State registries, charities that filed late or filed wrong. A Delaware entity with the same manager's signature as a Santa Fe nutrition pop-up that stayed open just long enough to process inaugural donations. I slid the folder across the table. Ethan hesitated, then opened it. Inside were printouts with yellow tabs, copies of articles that had disappeared from websites but not from cache memory. A list of company names that looked related once you saw them together, and a one-page sheet with contact information for an assistant U.S. attorney in Albuquerque, whose name came to me via a parishioner's nephew who worked federal cases and owed Pastor Lee a favor. The first page had a photo that wasn't a photo so much as a freeze frame from a gym social feed, the trainer from the window smiling in a way that made me want to check the lock twice. "Darren Knox," I said. "He moved here last year. Listed as a managing member on 2 wellness startups, neither of which sold a single thing that a person could hold. He likes cash businesses and short leases. He also likes to be photographed next to other people's successes. He has opinions about payments that vanish into activation budgets." Ethan flipped pages, his face working through unpleasant arithmetic. "How did you—" "Public records are polite if you speak their language," I said. "And people leave fingerprints when they want to be applauded." He sat back and pressed his knuckles to his mouth. Whatever posture he'd perfected in firm conference rooms was missing tonight. I don't deserve this, he said into his hands, which could have meant the stew or the folder, or being allowed a chair at my table at all. I reached into the tote a second time and set a long white envelope beside the folder. The paper made the same sound all important paper makes. He didn't touch it. What's that? A cashier's check for $50, I said. Pay your lawyer, hire a forensic accountant who isn't your friend. Stop saying we when you mean I, and stop saying strategy when you mean excuse. I kept my tone even because admonitions take better when they're not salted. He looked at the envelope like one looks at water in a drought. On what condition, he asked finally, because he has always understood that money alters air. On the condition that you tell me the sentence I needed from you in Boston, I said. Not a performance, not a plan, a sentence that understands itself. He closed his eyes and kept them closed longer than comfort. When he opened them, the room was the same, which is sometimes the point. He tried once, and it came out as legal scaffolding. He tried again and stripped off the parts that admire themselves. The third time he said it like a person and not like a professional. I was wrong, he said, each word finding its own chair. I put image and convenience in what other people might think ahead of your life. I didn't want to disrupt the version of myself I liked being. I hurt you. I'm asking for your help. I will do what is required without pretending it's a favor. The sentence arrived. It didn't aggrandize and didn't beg. It acknowledged a ledger with entries you don't get to erase. I exhaled in a way I hadn't since the clinic turned my blood into a math problem. Good, I said, eat your stew. He laughed without much voice and obeyed. The green chile woke, the back of his throat brought color to his face. Ben drifted by, collected the folder's weight with his eyes, and kept his questions for another time. We walked from the cafe to the casita, not because it was far, but because walking sorts information. The air had that late afternoon clarity New Mexico gives as a consolation for other harsher things. In the kitchen, I poured water without asking. Ethan stood at the counter where I'd line up receipts and let his hands lie still. He touched the blue scarf draped over the chair back and then removed his hand as if he'd opened a drawer that wasn't his. I need to call the AUSA, he said. You need to call your lawyer, I corrected, and let your lawyer call the AUSA. You also need to stop narrating this as a brand problem. I moved the envelope closer to him with my fingertip. Names have weight. You helped other people carry theirs. Now carry your own. He nodded, not in agreement so much as acceptance. He took out his phone, stared at it, put it away. He reached for the envelope the way a person reaches for a banister while the lights are still coming on. I watched his mouth form a thank you and then close. Gratitude is truer for being quiet. At the table, I opened my ledger because I am never more myself than with a pencil in my hand. On the left side of the page, I wrote today's date and a short description, legal retainer, Ethan. On the right, I wrote the amount. I left a space beneath it because columns need room to breathe. He finished the water, set the glass on the counter, and stood with his palms flat as if ready to be searched. I kept telling myself I was protecting us, he said, tone-even eyes on the wood grain. By the time I noticed I was protecting a story instead, it was late. I didn't answer because he wasn't asking. The radiator ticked once, a small metal heartbeat. From the window, the mountain was doing its favorite evening trick, changing color while pretending not to move. A dog barked somewhere a street over and then remembered it had nothing particular to add. I gave Ethan the contact sheet. I'd prepared the bullet list of names that could be useful, the things not to say, the versions of the story that read like avoidance, and the versions that read like confession. He took it with the care you reserve for something both fragile and sharp. Thank you, he said this time out loud. For this, for meeting me, for not. He stopped before he asked me not to do something he didn't deserve to ask. Thank you, he said again, letting the period be the point. He left with the check in his pocket and the folder tucked under his arm in the exact place where a person pretends to keep courage. I watched him step into the later light, shoulders squared the way a man arranges himself for a difficult room. When the door closed, the casita resumed being one room with one person in it. I stood for a minute with my hands on the back of the chair, then sat and added a second line under the first documents transferred. I underlined both, not hard, just enough to feel the groove in the paper through the pencil. The scarf held the day's warmth. I folded it once and set it beside the ledger. Outside, a breeze lifted the edge of the doormat and set it down again. The apartment's small noises found their places. The table held its neat, honest clutter, the ledger, the pencil, a glass half full, and a square of paper with a phone number written twice because writing it once had not been sufficient. The news arrived as paper and breath. First, the envelope from the Attorney General's office with a seal that looked heavier than the page, then a phone call that turned careful. Ethan's lawyer spoke in clauses trimmed to the bone, cooperating witness secured. Funds traced. Charging decision declined as to your son. Victim services will make contact. I held the receiver between ear and shoulder and read the letter again the way you read a road sign, twice even when you know you're on the right highway. A second envelope followed a week later, this one from the Board of Bar Overseers. The phrasing was dry as crackers. Administrative leave concluded. No formal discipline. Advisory letter issued. Somewhere in Boston, a file closed with a sound only clerks notice. I set both letters on the table beside the ledger and wrote 2 small words that made the pencil feel lighter, case resolved. Ben brought over coffee and a stubborn cinnamon roll and said nothing, which is its own kind of toast. He tapped the newspaper with one finger where a small story mentioned a broader investigation into wellness entities registered in 3 states. No names in print. It was enough. When Ethan came back to Santa Fe, the air had warmed into the kind of afternoon that turns adobe into memory. He stood in the doorway of the casita as if it were a photograph he wasn't sure he was allowed to enter. I rinsed 2 glasses and filled them from the tap. He set a long envelope on the table and did not sit until I nodded. A cashier's check, he said, and slid it toward me. The bank watermark shimmered faintly under the window light. 95,000. He didn't narrate it. He didn't decorate it. He placed his hands flat on the table and watched the number exist between us. I turned the envelope over, broke the seal, and took out the check. The amount had a way of altering the oxygen. I reached for a pen, wrote "pay to the order of," and let my hand finish the sentence. St. Vincent Cancer Center Patient Assistance Fund. On the memo line, I added 2 words that belonged to the past and also to the present for treatment. I signed my name and set it aside. Then I opened my checkbook, wrote a smaller check to St. Bridget's emergency envelope, and slipped both into stamped addressed envelopes waiting in a stack near the sugar jar. Ethan watched the movements, not my face. "You're not going to argue with me about it?" he asked. "I'm not," I said. "You brought it. I'm sending it." He nodded and let the silence earn its keep. The blue scarf lay over the back of the chair. He lifted it, hesitated, then rested it on the table like a truce. "I've missed this," he said, not specifying what this was because we both understood that naming can shrink a thing. We walked to the cafe because walking was the first language we learned together. The light had that New Mexico insistence that makes objects honest. Ben saved the corner table and served stew as if ritual could be plated. A couple of regulars waved the small wave you use for neighbors you're rooting for. Ethan ate with the appetite of someone who had run out of adjectives and found a better verb. On the way back, the breeze lifted dust in a way that made it look intentional. We stopped at the plaza where a guitarist tuned a borrowed instrument and found a chord that fit the afternoon. No speeches, no inventory of mistakes. We shared a paper cup of lemonade tart enough to reset the mouth and sat long enough to call it sitting. Back at the casita, I set the addressed envelopes by the door where I wouldn't trust memory to do the job alone. Ethan stood at the counter, touched the ledger's corner, and observed the neatness the way you observe a well-made bed. "You always liked lines," he said, a half smile that didn't try for more than half. "They keep the ink where you intend it," I said. He looked at the scarf again and this time lifted it with both hands, then draped it around my shoulders like a thing returned to its element. The wool remembered Boston winter in a room that didn't. We stood like that for a breath neither of us measured. He left before the light gave up entirely. No promises, no vows, just a hug he didn't rush, and a goodbye that landed where it should. I watched him walk down the path, shoulders level, the envelope impressions on the table slowly losing their definition. I dropped the letters in the mailbox on the corner and listened to them hit metal. Back inside, I washed 2 glasses and set them upside down on a towel. The ledger waited in its usual place. I opened it, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 3 lines in a hand, steadier than the one that had started all this. St. Vincent mailed. St. Bridget's mailed. Balanced breathing room. I capped the pen, straightened the stack of mail, folded the scarf once, and let the room be a room again. Outside, piñon smoke found its way into the evening. The mountain changed color without ceremony. The radiator ticked once as if remembering some other winter somewhere else. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.